Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sydney Siegel with the Organization of American Historians. Today's webinar, Navigating the Freedom of Information Act request process, is part of a series of free professional development webinars for historians that are made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today's webinar features two researchers with extensive experience navigating the FOIA process. Matthew Guariglia is a historian of policing, state power, and race. He is an affiliated scholar at University of California, Hastings School of Law and a policy analyst of privacy and surveillance at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. His upcoming book, Police in the Empire City, Race and the Origins of Modern Policing in New York, is under contract with Duke University Press. Kiran Misra is an academic researcher and investigative journalist studying the carceral state and criminalization, specifically how the political process and political interests, rather than policy outcomes, drive criminal justice policymaking. She is an incoming JD PhD student in Harvard University's Government Department and currently works as a research assistant in Stanford University and University of Chicago's Sociology departments, is a Fulbright Scholar in Berlin, staff writer at Southside Weekly, and fellow at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. We will be taking questions from attendees using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you need assistance during the webinar, please chat either myself or my colleague, Beth Marsh, using the chat feature. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the OAH website later this week. With that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll let Kiran go ahead and give a little bit of discussion as to her experience with FOIA requests.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to make this quite practical. So first, I'm going to give an overview of what FOIA is, how you should approach writing a request, how you do that, who you should be directing these requests towards, and then I'll talk a little bit about my experience using FOIA, which has largely been as a journalist, but also more recently as an academic researcher. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yeah? If you can't, well, I'll just be talking through what actually are some really nice slides. So this is the Freedom of Information Act. And so earlier today, when I was telling my boyfriend that I was going to be talking about FOIA, he's like, oh yeah, that thing you're always talking about, like FERPA or whatever. I was like, no, FERPA is Privacy Act, I think. I actually don't know what FERPA is, but FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. It's pretty old, it's several decades old, and basically it was created so the public and media, academics, anyone could have more access to government information. And so what is FOIA? Basically, it is a way to get information from the government. So you can't file a FOIA request to your neighbor or to Walmart, but you can file a FOIA request to either the federal government or the state government or any government agencies. And different jurisdictions have different FOIA laws. And so this is important to know because if you're trying to FOIA the FBI versus trying to FOIA the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, there's going to be different rules that regulate that. And sometimes there's going to be different ways that you make those requests and different types of exemptions on what types of information you can request and what types of information they're required to give you. But basically, it's a law that all 50 states have and also the federal government has that requires certain types of records that the government keeps, makes, and maintains to be made public. So I basically knew nothing when I filed my first FOIA request. I wanted some information from, I think it was the Cook County Jail, and I basically just asked a colleague of mine, how do I file this FOIA request? And they drafted a FOIA request for me, and I pretty much copied and pasted the language from that FOIA request into every FOIA request I've ever made since. And so it's very, very easy to get started writing the request. So this is generally what it looks like. Like I've looked at a lot of FOIA requests since that FOIA request that I sent maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, and they all actually look pretty much the same, whether it's from an established investigative journalist or someone who's like writing their first FOIA request in their closet, which is what I was doing like 2 years ago. So at the top, you want to know who you're addressing the FOIA request to, and then you need to say who you are. So in this case, I was a representative of the news media, and I'll talk about why that's important to state who you are a little bit later on. Then you invoke the FOIA law. So here I was filing a local FOIA request to the CPD, the Chicago Police Department. And so I cited the Illinois law rather than federal law. And then I was very specific about what I wanted. So here I wanted citation stops, arrests, other law enforcement actions for 3 days of protests during the racial justice protests 2 years ago. And then I asked really, really specifically all the types of information I wanted. So date, time, block number, location code, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really, really important because one thing that you should keep in mind when writing a FOIA request is it's kind of like asking a genie for a wish. So they'll sometimes give you exactly what you want if you're not careful about being really specific about exactly what you want. So the more directed you can make it to prevent it from going wrong at the front of the process, the more time you'll save yourself later and the more likely you're going to get what you actually want. So this was my first FOIA request ever. I basically pitched a piece that I had been to these racial justice protests and I seemed to observe that there was racial disparities in arrests being made. And I wanted to find out if that was the case. And so the way that I was able to do that was to ask for all the arrest data from the Chicago Police Department. This slide was the one that was literally the request that I sent. And this is the data that I got back. So all the arrest information and exactly what I asked for, the arrest date, the address, the district, et cetera, et cetera. And anyone can do it. Like this was the first time I had ever filed a FOIA request ever in my whole life. And like this piece won an award for best deadline reporting from the Society of Professional Journalists. So I had no idea what I was doing. I was like literally copying and pasting a FOIA that a friend had sent me and it turned out fine. So anytime you're like, oh, I don't think I know what I'm doing. I don't have enough experience. These government agencies are so powerful. I don't know how to navigate the bureaucracy. You should just go for it because the more FOIAs you submit, the better you get at the process. And even if it's like not a very well thought out one, which my first one wasn't, you can still get a lot of valuable information. So that was one approach that I took where I was like, oh, I want to get some data, then I'll look at it and I'll see if I find any interesting information or any other trends. But another better approach is if you already know like what question you want asked, what question you want answered, and specifically what data you want. So you have a sense of what you're looking for already, which is what I did in this piece. I was looking for some really specific documents. I already had a sense of what they would say based on what other people had told me. And I wanted to just get confirmation and get proof of this. And I often think that like, especially in social science research, a lot of people are really driven by finding a cool new data set and then thinking backwards, like, okay, I have this data, what can I do with it? Like, let me find some question or find some claim that I can make because I have this cool data. But often what's more compelling is having an actual question that you want answered or something you've actually observed and then seeing if it's backed up by the data instead of trying to work backwards from just having a spreadsheet. And that is what I did in this piece, which I think worked much better for me and saved me a lot of time. And you can get a lot of different types of data. So in the first story, I basically just got a spreadsheet of numbers and information, but here I also got things like reports from public meetings and memos and interdepartmental emails and things like that. So you can both get qualitative and quantitative data from a FOIA request, which I think is a really interesting thing, especially given like the current trend towards big data and quantitative analysis, that you can get a lot of really, really useful information by looking through memos and emails and public meeting reports and things like that. So what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is basically just talk you through the process of how you can file a FOIA request. And I hope that by the end of this, you will feel like you can definitely do it and know what you should be thinking about while you're doing it. So before you even file a FOIA request, these are some questions you can ask yourself. So first is, do you actually need to use FOIA? A lot of times the information that you're looking for can be found in different ways and might already be out there. So if you can get this information by just interviewing someone or by looking on a website that already publishes information or finding it in like any other way that doesn't require going through a government agency, if the thing that you're investigating is something like a corporation or a private entity, you might not be able to use FOIA or you might not want to use FOIA. FOIA is one tool. And I think since FOIA is getting more popular these days, a lot of people are like, oh, FOIA, like it's how I'm going to get all my information, but it's only one way of getting information. So before you start FOIA-ing everything, think about whether it's really the best way to get the information you want. And the way to know that is if it's like a government record, basically, is the time that you should be using FOIA. Has someone requested this information already? So on a lot of government agency websites, they have records of all of the FOIA requests that have already been submitted. So for example, CPD on their website, they basically have a list of all of the FOIAs that have already been filed, and they publish that information so you don't have to file that FOIA yourself. So before filing a FOIA request yourself, you might want to look at the website if the government agency you're trying to request something from has one, and see if someone has already requested it. Then you have to think about which agency has this information. And this part can be kind of tricky. So I work mostly in criminal justice. And one thing that I'm always asking myself is, okay, should this request be going to the mayor's office? Should it be going to the state's attorney's office? Should it be going to the sheriff's office? Should it be going to the police? Should it be going to any other agency? Because there's dozens of agencies, and most likely only one or two of them will have access to the type of information you want, but it can be very hard to figure out which is the one that you want to get information from. And so part of this just comes from familiarity with the system. The more FOIA requests you file, the more likely you are to know which agencies have the information you need. But if you file a FOIA request and you don't get the information you need, it doesn't mean that it's not a good request or that type of record isn't kept. It might just mean that you need to file it towards another agency. This is something I touched on before. What is the question you're trying to answer? Through asking this question, you might realize that you don't actually need FOIA data. So it's always a good question to ask yourself. And then what documents might be generated in the process of making a decision? So this is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, but it's important when you're using FOIA to have a document-based mindset, because that's all that FOIA is. It's basically a document release law. And so if you're trying to find something that is not likely to already have a record kept of it or to already be documented, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to get that information through FOIA, because the agency is basically just going to say that it's unduly burdensome or this isn't something that is already collected. And so sometimes I've asked for information and the FOIA officer said, we don't keep records of this, or to compile this type of information would involve creating new records, which would be really burdensome for us to be creating. And it's not something that we already have, so we don't have to give it to you. So if you're thinking, okay, what is the Chicago Police Department's overtime policy, which is something that I've looked into, then you might want to think, okay, this might be explained in emails, setting up meetings. It might be set up in memos. It might be set up in directives. It might be reflected in an organizational flowchart. It might be like kept record of through payroll. There's many documents that are generated and kept in the process of maintaining bureaucracy and making decisions, but you need to be pretty specific about what those documents are, because you need to request those documents specifically. So in that first slide that I showed in the request, I mentioned something like, okay, I want like memos, I want emails, I want directives. And if you don't ask for it, you probably won't get it, but you can be broad. You can say including but not limited to ensure that you get as many types of information as possible, but you're not excluding yourself from things that they might be giving you if you weren't saying, I only want this, this, and this. And then the last thing that you should think about before filing, and this is, I think, more focused towards journalists, which is the population that I normally give this talk to, is what is your time frame? So I think with historians, there might be a bit of a longer time frame or an eye towards, you know, a more expansive project. But if you want a quick response and need information really quickly, FOIA is likely not going to come through for you. It's not like you can get something on deadline by the end of the day or request for comment. It's something that often takes weeks. A part of the FOIA law is that they have to give it to you in a timely manner, but they can request extensions. And so sometimes you can get information in as little as 2 weeks, or even if you like have a good relationship with a FOIA officer, in as little as a week, but oftentimes it can take weeks, if not months, if not years. And sometimes it can involve lawsuits depending on how badly you want the information. And so FOIA is really the way to go if you're trying to uncover something on a longer time frame. The information might already be out there. So this is what I mentioned before. Someone else might have already requested it, but also oftentimes things like police department directives, those are just published online. And so you don't necessarily need to submit a FOIA request for everything you might want. A lot of it is actually just already out there, which is great. It saves you work. There's like no greater moral good to having to work harder to get information. So this is something I mentioned earlier, is the document mindset. So you always need to be thinking about what types of documents are generated in the process of getting to the decision that I want to get insight into or making this type of policy. If a document is not generated in the process of whatever thing you're trying to investigate, it's very, very unlikely that you will be able to get anything on it through FOIA. Okay, so those are the things that you should think about before filing. Now, when you're filing, basically it's a one-page document, maybe a little longer, that you're actually submitting. And in a couple of slides, I'll tell you where you submit that. But basically at the top, you put the header, then you define your role. And the reason why it's important to define your role is because sometimes you have to pay to get this type of information, but if you're an academic or a journalist, you can get it for free. And so you want to say that I'm a reporter with this news outlet, or I am a PhD student or a professor or a researcher with this university. Basically, that'll just save you money. Be very specific in scope. And so some of the things that I showed you earlier, like have a really specific date range for the documents you want. Otherwise, they can very, very easily say it's unduly burdensome. And this is a phrase that FOIA officers love, is unduly burdensome. So if you are actually only looking for information within like a couple of weeks or a couple of years, be really specific about that. Otherwise, they'll assume that you want every arrest ever made or something like that. And they can really, really easily deny that, and you'll never get your information. Keywords. And so as the example I was using before, I was looking at overtime. And so I said, okay, all emails that use the phrase like overtime or like overtime reduction or clocking in or clocking out, like basically keywords that you want, because a lot of times what FOIA officers do is they search using keywords for the types of documents that you're looking for in like their internal database or server or something like that. And so if you give them the keywords that they want, again, they'll find it harder to make the case to say that it's unduly burdensome. Know the law. So the law for FOIA is different in every state, and it's also different federally. And this can really dictate what types of information the government will release to you, what types of waivers you need signed for things that might have privacy issues. And so as you keep filing in the jurisdiction that you most often file in, you'll become familiar with them. Like I mostly file in Illinois, and so I'm quite familiar with Illinois FOIA law, but it just depends on where you're studying, where you're trying to get information from. FOIA laws aren't too different between jurisdictions. Like after filing a lot of requests in FOIA, for FOIA in Chicago and in Illinois, I started filing federally, and I mostly cited the same stuff, but there are some differences. And so you should make sure you know those before you file, because it'll save you a lot of time if you do it up front. And then track your requests. And so once you start getting really comfortable with FOIA, you'll be like, wow, I can get so much information. And you might have like 15 records out or 15 records requests out at the same time. But as I said before, like they can take a really long time to fulfill them. They might be like denying them for no reason. They might be asking for extensions. They might just not be getting back to you. Because you file a FOIA request doesn't mean that you're definitely going to get information back. And so you sometimes really, really need to follow up. And this is why it's like important to keep a spreadsheet or some other tracking device that keeps track of how long ago you filed it, whether you've received an extension request, whether it's been completely fulfilled or partially fulfilled, because FOIA officers, in my experience, really need to be prodded and followed up with and kept on top of if you are committed to getting the information you want. It's not something that if you send it out, it'll definitely come back with the thing that you want. Yeah, so this is just like an example of what I mentioned earlier, being specific. So for this story, I was looking at overtime, and here you can see like I asked for the officer first and last name, the officer badge number, the unit name number, the shift schedule between these specific dates, shorthand first watch, second watch, they should define it. Basically like anything that might be unclear, any information you could potentially want, you have to list out really, really specifically. Like just think of FOIA as like a genie that you have to be so specific with, and like you can never be too specific. Know the law. So this was an example of where I actually didn't know the law. And so I filed a FOIA request to the Cook County Sheriff's Office. And basically they said that due to privacy concerns, I needed to get all these waivers of liability and privacy releases because I was trying to get information on someone who had died in the jail. And so I need to go back to their family, their attorney, and get all these signatures and get all these clearances. I need to get like a death certificate. And so I would have saved myself a lot of time and effort upfront had I known that that was part of the process. So knowing the law is always really useful. Okay, and then like last part is where to request. And so most places that you want to file a FOIA request to have an online portal. Not all of them do, but most of them do. And if they don't, they have been email. It now is quite uncommon that you have to like physically mail a request somewhere. I've never done that. So there should either be an online portal or an email. Here, Chicago, City of Chicago has an online portal. And so the best way to do this actually is just Google search like Chicago Police Department FOIA, and then it'll tell you how to do it. It really differs from agency to agency. There's no blanket advice, but usually you'll have to make an account, and then you can track your requests inside your account in the portal, but they'll also send you an email. And then sometimes they don't have a portal, and so you just email the FOIA officer, and they correspond with you directly through email rather than through a government website. But my advice here is just to Google it. Okay, and so you've filed your request. Amazingly, you've gotten back some information, big win, not too many extensions after the request. It's important to still like have a really skeptical mindset, because oftentimes the information you get back is kind of bad. So be really skeptical, confirm with alternate sources what remains undefined, and did they actually give you what you wanted? So here's one example of why this is important and how you should be looking into this and how it can turn into a story in and of itself. So earlier this year, as a researcher, not as a journalist, I was trying to get some information as a part of a research group on carjackings, because there was this narrative in Chicago that these carjackings were being done by young people in Chicago. It was being used to create all these policies that were creating laws that were just leading to young people being arrested more. And so we requested data on carjackings, like who was doing the carjackings, where were the carjackings happening, what the police department is doing to follow up on them. And the data that we got back showed a much, much higher recovery rate than the data that was published online. And there was a discrepancy in the data that we received and some of the press releases that were coming out of the mayor's office. And we found that this was because carjacking was being defined in two different ways. There was like vehicular hijacking and aggravated vehicular hijacking. And the city was basically only using one of those categorizations, which had a higher recovery rate, to make claims about how effective the police department was being in recovering those cars, and also who was committing those carjackings. And so by comparing the records that we got back, which is this, against other types of data sets that were out there, against the public statements that people, state and city officials had been making about this, we were able to see that something didn't match up, something strange was going on. And that was able to become a story in and of itself. Similarly, the second example that I have here is a FOIA that I filed in DC. And they said, oh, like this, we don't even need to fulfill this FOIA. The information that you're looking for is already out there on this website. And I looked at the website and it was something that was like very different from what I was actually requesting. And so it's good to not always assume that the FOIA officer knows best all of the time, because what I wanted was something completely different that would require them to generate some records, but it was records that they were required to give me. So even though they published this one type of data online and I wanted something slightly different, you can ask for the slightly different thing, because as the member of the public, you are the person who has the rights, and you can ask for anything you want. And they have to at least try to give it to you. And if they don't give it to you, the ball is in their court to prove why they can't give it to you, not on you to prove that it's not too much work for them to give it to you. And so in this case, I basically went back to them and I asked for them to actually give me the thing that they were not giving me. They said it would be unduly burdensome. I cited the law, and then eventually they did give me the thing that I wanted. And so being persistent is really important. And then the thing I mentioned before about the vehicular hijackings, basically with that information and seeing that there was a discrepancy between the data that we received. Another problem with the data is that we noticed that there was a lot of information missing. So the vehicle year, vehicle make, vehicle model for a lot of these carjackings was missing. And it got us thinking, like, how do the police know what they're looking for if they don't have any information about the car? Like, what is this data that's being collected? Or like, what is going on with all these vehicular hijackings that no one even knows what the car was? And so with these questions, we were able to publish an academic report and a journalistic story about how the city's narrative around vehicular hijackings was not entirely true to the actual data. And we wouldn't have been able to do this work had we not been really skeptical about the information we received. So it's important to, when you get your information back, not to be like, oh, great, the information I wanted. Now I can write my journal article or solve my mystery. To be like, is this the information that I wanted? Is something being kept from me? Is someone trying to hide something, or is someone just uncritically giving me information that might not be what I even wanted in the first place? And I think that's pretty much all I have. Yes, those are all the slides I have in terms of like how to get from beginning to the end of the FOIA process. But if you have any questions about any of this, I'd be happy to answer them, because I do understand that some of this can be a little bit more journalism directed because my experience is mostly as a journalist.
Thank you so much, Kiran. Do you want to go ahead and talk about your experience, Matthew? And then we'll have Q&A later after Matthew goes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. That was great and very thorough. I wish I had that talk a few years ago when I was starting to send FOIA requests. But my experience is as a journalist, as an activist, as a hobbyist, and most importantly, and most recently, as a historian. And so I think I'll tailor a little bit what I'm going to say toward people who are studying the past. But first, I want to make the argument for using FOIA for historical research, because for a lot of people, even if you think your project does not require FOIA, even if you're not interested in like what's happening inside the FBI at that time, it's still a great resource because truly you never know what people were in those rooms. So, I have found by filing off like a random request to the FBI for somebody who is not involved in radicalism or activism or labor organizing or what have you, that they might still have a small file in the FBI because people in their life might have been concerned about their politics and wrote in to kind of rat them out to the FBI. Or sometimes there was an FBI person in a meeting where there is no other written evidence, written sources from inside that meeting, that you have documents that, granted, are incredibly slanted because they're through the lens of a kind of FBI informant or an FBI agent, but yet nonetheless it gives you some sources inside that room, so you never really know what's going to be in the FBI. So I would advocate that no matter what you're studying, send off a few FOIAs just to see if the person or the organization or the event that you're interested in has a small file or some investigation somewhere. And it doesn't have to be with the FBI. It could be with the State Department or local police or the Bureau of Prisons or what have you. And so I guess I will start by saying that I guess I'll start with a few of the key lessons that I've learned in doing research as a historian using FOIA. And one is that, and I think this was touched on very nicely, is that if you were on a time frame, if you were hoping to publish a book in the next 2 years, hinging that book on what you hope to get through FOIA is not a great idea. Usually the way I've done projects in the past is the first time I have an inkling that something might be interesting, I will send off a few requests. And if I get those back in 6 to 8 months, that's great. I have time for follow-up. But really, I find that collecting files as you go and just keeping a folder on your desktop, that one day, once you get enough information, that might make an interesting article or an interesting chapter of the book, you can turn to it. But starting the project first and then filing the requests often isn't the most timely way to go, because there are specific requests I'm still waiting for 6 or 7 years later. And especially if the agencies you're FOIA requesting have transferred those documents to the National Archives, then you have to add a minimum of 5 or 6 years onto when you're going to get those documents back. So I would suggest, collecting files as you go, and then coming up with, what that project is going to be once you can do that, and add contextual research around it first. The next I would say is to go to places where there are already declassified, released to the public documents, and familiarize yourself with their formats, because it's absolutely right that you have to ask for these documents as specifically as possible. And the more familiar you are with the bureaucracy, with the headings of the documents, with the types of investigations, the types of memorandas, the different indicators of where they might be stored, even if you're familiar with the different, like the FBI alone has like 5 or 6 different archives. And if you can tailor a request for what archive you want them to search, that is more and more useful. And the way you can do that is just by doing research before you do research, by looking at the documents, looking at how they're organized, and familiarizing yourself with kind of the internal structure of information management at these various agencies. Another thing is to be creative in your requests and where you send requests. I was researching a piece a few years ago on the NYPD's use of undercover taxi cabs. And the NYPD is an infamous organization that does not give away documents lightly. And so ultimately what I did was I filed some requests with the Taxi and Limousine Commission. And they were able to give me documents that I needed to confirm the existence of these undercover taxi cabs, how many there were, whether or not they had gotten parking tickets recently. And so sometimes casting a wide net and going to organizations that are less big and secure is a way to do it. And that's true both of going to, organizations that are, not your usual FOIA requested organizations, because usually the less FOIA requests they get, the quicker they turn around documents in my experience, but also in sometimes going to smaller departments. I was part of a big multi-newsroom investigation a few years ago, trying to map every police station in the country and the military equipment they had gotten through the Department of Defense's 1033 program in order to create a kind of master ledger. And we found that turnaround at the small departments was 10 times faster than at the larger departments like your LAPD, Chicago Police, NYPD. So definitely don't underestimate sending a request to some of those smaller departments. Sometimes their retention, especially for historians, sometimes their retention policies are not as good. If they keep an archive, a lot of that will be transferred to state archives or municipal archives. So keep an eye out for some of those data retention policies, which kind of brings me to another point, which is another point that was made very well, which is sometimes you don't need FOIA requests. Sometimes just like sending a friendly email to the information officer at some of these agencies will yield a lot of results as to where those documents might be if they've been transferred, what you might request. Sometimes they can give you keys to like what you can specifically ask for. So just sending an email and being in touch with FOIA officers sometimes really pays off. And sometimes you don't even need to send a FOIA request. You find that those documents are available elsewhere. And I think Heather Thompson has some great stories about just reaching out to archivists who are just like, yeah, I'll just come in, I'll just let you see them, no FOIA request necessary. And so sometimes that really does pay off. And so I guess what I'll talk about now is, so what it looks like if you just are interested in researching a specific person. So for instance, I was thinking about William Z. Foster, the former president of the US Communist Party. And the first thing you'll notice when you send in a FOIA request is because they are looking for any excuse to reject your request, is oftentimes the first thing they'll say is, well, how do we know this person is dead? Because when you request a Freedom of Information Act file, you either need to prove that that person is dead, or you need to get written permission from that person to have access to their file, because otherwise it's seen as an invasion of their privacy. And so a lot of times, even though you'll say like William Z. Foster, who died in 1961, they will say, how do we know that this person is dead? And oftentimes you will have to attach a PDF of that person's obituary, if you could find an obituary of that person, which usually clears that first hurdle. And so if I were asking for any information an agency had on him, I would usually first start with his name, just anything you have, mentioning or pertaining to William Z. Foster. I would probably send a follow-up file for what organizations he was a part of. I would probably, and usually narrow that down by what years I was interested in. If he had any close associates and people he worked with closely, I would probably ask for their files as well, because they might have not only mentions of Foster, but also maybe communications intercepted between Foster and this person. I would ask for maybe things that might have drawn specific investigations, so specific incidents or events that might have yielded their own files. I would probably ask for them as well. Also, you might want to think about specifically asking for different types of media, right? So you want memorandums, you want communications, you might want newspaper clippings, but also it's important to, especially if you're looking into the later 20th century, photos, videos, and audio, because those are sitting there as well. And you can ask for them, specifically as an MP4 or as an MP3 in its native form is usually how they're most willing to send it. A lot of times you will get a very annoying CD-ROM in the mail that you will need to find a CD-ROM player for. And then you also specifying by what archives do you think they might be in. So if they might be in field offices. So if you were requesting for William Z. Foster, you might say, files held by FBI headquarters, files held in the Chicago field office or the New York City field office. And then you might think about what other agencies as well. So if Foster went abroad at all, you might think about asking the State Department and the CIA as well as the FBI. You might think about, red squads or intelligence squads at the state police and local police level. And so all of these things, so just interested in one person, you might end up having to file 15 or 20 requests with multiple agencies across multiple states, specifying a lot of different things. And so these kind of investigations can really spiral. And some of those you might get back quickly, and some of those you might have to wait years for. Some of them might be rejected because, like you said, they might be too burdensome. And this is kind of the harms of getting too much data. Not just because it might be too burdensome, because they say, going through 50 years of FBI records looking for every mention of, somebody named Mr. Jones. There's no way we can do that. Your request is rejected. But there's also a danger, and this has happened to me a lot of times in requesting a file, and they'll say, yes, we can get that to you, but it constitutes 2 million pages. And to pay for man hours and duplication fees, the fee we are charging you for that is $25,000. Because they will charge after the first, I think sometimes the first 200 pages are free, and after that it costs by both labor hours and also by duplication fees. And so sometimes you can narrow that down. Sometimes you can say, okay, well, I only want from 1951 to 1957. Sometimes you can say, I don't want duplications, because a lot of times you'll see CC duplications in there. Sometimes you can say, I don't want newspaper clippings. I just want the kind of memoranda and the good stuff. And sometimes agencies will be willing to work with you and narrow that down a little bit, but sometimes not. So for instance, like when I've requested all of the FBI files on the industrial workers of the world, they were like, this file is 80 years long and constitutes millions of pages. That's just not going to cut it. And you definitely are going to want to narrow down by years, by incidents, by individuals. And I think I'll stop there because I'm eager to get to some questions and Q&As and have a chat about this. But thank you all for having me, and I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, that was a very enlightening, I think, different part, but no less helpful than what Kiran was talking about. So I think one of the first questions that we will discuss is actually something that I don't think either of you have touched on, but is there an appeal process for FOIA? And in this instance, when do you use the appeal process, and should you use the appeal process, and have either of you used the appeal process?
Yeah, I have used it. I have used it to limited success, I will say, because sometimes there'll just be, when you want to appeal, sometimes you know that it's not right. If you sent a request for a prominent labor activist who was active in the 1950s and 60s to the FBI, and they said, sorry, we don't have anything, it's a little suspicious. It's a little suspect. I would go back and check your request, make sure you have their name right. Maybe they have like a first name that you didn't realize, and they went by their middle name, or who knows what it might be. But I would send an appeal, and sometimes appeals are much more burdensome. They make you like send in a written letter that you have to stamp and send in somewhere, and the wait process to hear back is like 3 to 4 months. But I mean, unfortunately, I can say that I've never had a successful appeal. mostly because most of the appeals I've sent are to agencies that are notorious for just not giving up any information. So like the CIA and the NYPD, I think, are two of the most impenetrable organizations that, like, it's almost impossible to get documents out of them, unless you're asking for like really specific things that are not involved in any ongoing investigations or something which might reveal agency tactics or what have you. So appeals are really burdensome. And then if an appeal doesn't work, that's where we've said that's where lawsuits come in. And I don't know if you mentioned a lot about FOIA lawsuits, but how it works is if you win a lawsuit, the agency that has withheld the documents has to pay your legal fees. So there are a handful of lawyers out there who will take these fees if they think that it is likely your case is to win. So keep that in mind. And if you do a quick Google, there are at least a dozen lawyers out there who have been in high publicized FOIA cases for historians, for journalists. So definitely keep an eye out and collect those names in case you have a request that you just know there are documents sitting there, and maybe you can convince an attorney to help you sue.
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of luck with appealing FOIA requests, but I think it's because I do a lot more work locally rather than with the FBI. And normally, like what I have done actually is like with people I'm reporting with, going DTL, direct to litigation. And it's because in Chicago, there's like a really robust pro bono ecosystem for FOIA litigation. And so there's a lot of lawyers who will do this work for free for journalists and the public interest. And not only have I been successful, like having won those FOIA cases, I mean, like having this lawyer who's arguing on our behalf winning the FOIA cases, I am not personally winning them, but also the threat of the lawsuit can usually get you the documents. This is what has worked for me far more often, is a lawsuit starts getting underway, like the case is progressing, and then like a couple of months in, usually like CPD or some other agency that has been really dragging their feet or saying that they don't keep a certain type of record or redacting something, will just like give it to me and invalidate the need for a lawsuit altogether. And so I actually don't think I've ever submitted like a FOIA appeal, but litigation has been very successful. And there are a lot of attorneys who, especially like in Chicago, will do this type of work like in the public interest pro bono. So if you are in the situation and you're looking for someone to go to, you can email me and I can put you in touch with someone.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have another question, and this is a little bit more specific, but it involves a person who successfully received a mass amount of FBI records several years ago, but most of the content was redacted. And this was during a time when most of the copies were paper records from pre-digital years. And they were wondering about whether or not there's merit, since it's been about 30 years, in resubmitting a FOIA request for those same documents. Do you guys have any insight on that?
Yeah, I would say probably that would be worthwhile, because it could be the case that some of those people mentioned in the files were still alive at that time, which warranted the redactions. And so filing again might yield new results, especially because an interesting thing is once a person has submitted a FOIA request and that has already been kind of like buttoned up, people who request that in the future have an easier and faster time getting it. So if you're filing a request for something that archivists at the FBI or other agencies have never been through before, it's going to take a lot longer than if it's a very popular request. Like if you're trying to get Muhammad Ali's FBI file now, like so many people have requested and gotten that document that if you sent it in now, you would probably get it within a couple of weeks. But so if that's already been done, it's possible that you could get it fairly quickly. And because it was so long ago, it's possible that a lot of those people who were involved in those files have died since. And so you will get a lot more redacted. It could also be that Some of those were involved with active investigations, which might not be active anymore. And also I find that there's one way that they can withhold information, which is if they feel that it reveals too much about the kind of investigatory tactics of an agency. And so if those tactics have changed a lot since the 1970s, because everything is much more digital now or what have you, or they've changed the rule books 8 times since then those also might yield new passages that were redacted last time.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add. I don't know if like the digitization is what is going to be getting more likely to have unredacted results, but the fact that a lot of these cases might be closed now, or a lot of the people who you wanted information from might be now deceased, is something that makes it far more likely that you'll get the information you want today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question is actually about file types. So are there differences in the way that files are processed? Are there some file types that are processed smoother or quicker? Are there some file types that you should avoid requesting? And this also goes into something that I think you mentioned with the CD-ROM. Do you have any flexibility in, requesting how you receive files and, getting a PDF versus something, a file that you can edit or search? Do you have any, input in that?
Yeah, you definitely do. This is like going back to what I said about asking the genie about your specific wish. In the example of like the FOIA template that I use for all of my FOIA requests, I always say like, please provide these records in a digital format, such as a PDF or a CSV file. Oftentimes I'm requesting quantitative data, so I want it in like an Excel type spreadsheet. But you need to be like very specific about the exact file extension of the type of file you want to receive, because if you don't say like, oh, I want it in like a type of file that I can use in R or Stata or Excel, they'll give it to you like in a numbers file or like some like free Microsoft thing that you can't actually like use or open. And so if you're not really specific, they might just send you the format of whatever they are using, which might not be something that you can even open. And sometimes they'll even like say like, okay, like we'll mail this to you, the hard copy records, but then you'll have to pay for like printing and stuff. And so I would recommend, if it's like something that is amenable to your work, always trying to request them digitally, and then being very specific about the file type you want. So if you want like a Word document, is better if you want to use a screen reader, right? As opposed to a PDF, you can ask for those things. Otherwise the default might just be that they would give you a PDF, but they could just as easily give you something that's more accessible to you, for example. Oftentimes in these like online portals, if you are requesting through an online portal, they have like a place where you can say like, how do you want the record? Do you want it mailed to you? Do you want to pick it up? Do you want to just come in and inspect it? Or do you want a digital copy? I think those are usually the 4 options. And so you can also just check that. But if you're submitting like a written 1-page type request, you should always put this in your request, and you should say the specific file type. But in my experience, it hasn't been like this one is smoother to get or this one's faster to get. I would recommend requesting for the file format that is most easy for you to use and to access, instead of thinking about like, am I going to get this 2 weeks quicker than something else, for example?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I found that the FOIA requests that usually come back fastest and are the smoothest are emails, because you can just say like, you can pick out a specific person, maybe in a police department, and you can say, I want this person's emails. Like you can literally specify in the email bar, search the words, shot spotter, the acoustic gunshot detection, and just give me every email that comes up that mentions that word. And because the instructions are so specific, and because you know exactly how email works, and you know that every email that comes up that contains that word will come up, just download all of that and send it to me. Sometimes that is a very quick and easy way to get so I mean, obviously they'll go through the redaction process, which sometimes takes more time than others. But I found that, email is one of the easier ones, just because we are all so familiar with how the search function works.
That's really helpful. I had never actually considered that you could just request the file through email. But we do have another question, and this one is a little bit specific, so it may require a little bit more context. But so They recognize that this might be jurisdiction dependent, but do either of you have any impressions on how long agencies hold on to records? They're specifically referring to records that they requested from actually the Chicago Police Department about Fred Hampton, who was killed in 1969. They responded that they didn't have any, which was interesting, and they were confused about that response. So any information that you might have on that, or if you know of any avenues, whether or not you can use FOIA to request records that may otherwise not be available, if you have any insight.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because agencies, it's kind of a grab bag what they save and what they don't save. Some things they transfer to municipal archives, some things they destroy. The NYPD is a diligent destroyer of their own records. The reason why we have like this newfound treasure trove of intelligence and kind of red squad political policing files from the NYPD is because they were like found in a warehouse somewhere. So like some files survive just by like sheer negligence, and then we all get access to them, and some don't make it that long. So it really kind of depends. I would probably, in that case, FOIA the Chicago Police Department to ask for data retention, retention policies and documents, and that could be on their website, but I might just FOIA it anyways, just to agitate them. And then once I saw what it was, I probably would know if there was a greater chance for appeal. I might also, in that case, reach out to like a municipal archivist for the city of Chicago and ask them, where would a Chicago police file from this time be? Are they still exist? Are they hidden away somewhere? And just kind of lean on the knowledge of archivists who might have a lot of behind the scenes knowledge of the bureaucracy and where those files might be kept. And if they might say, oh no, the Chicago police destroyed everything from that era, and then for sure. But if there's an appeal that needs to be done, I would, do your due diligence to get to the bottom of seeing if that appeal would be effective.
Yeah, I'm surprised I actually don't know the answer to this because I almost exclusively FOIA CPD, but I'm not a historian, so a lot of the stuff that I'm requesting is more recent. But what I would do here is I would try to FOIA around this and get to it eventually. So agencies that would be in communication with CPD, seeing what types of records they have, if they have any correspondence with CPD, something like emails or memos or meeting minutes or anything like that, that you can use to get a specific toehold onto something you can request that is a little narrower in scope. I've done this before where I requested something from CPD that they said that they don't keep records of, and then I have gotten a meeting memo or a public statement that was released between two agencies, and I was able to use keywords or specific people to say, oh, I want information on this person's records or this person's communications on this particular matter, and then I was able to get it from CPD. So if you can go through something like the FBI or the state of Illinois or any other agency, maybe even the state's attorney's office that would have records on what you're looking for and see if they have communications with CPD about it, you might be able to narrow down your search. And assuming that all FOIA officers work in good faith, then if they were to look again using more specific search criteria or narrowing down the type of information they're looking for, they might actually be able to find the thing that you're asking for because it might have been too broad a request the first time.
It's also possible to be pleasantly surprised. I've sent FOIA requests to police departments on a whim for documents from the 1920s, and I've gotten them. And they weren't transferred to the municipal archives or to the National Archives. They weren't destroyed. They just still had boxes from that had been consolidated from that era. So sometimes it's, even if you think a police department would not have files from, the 1930s or 40s, it's possible to be surprised.
Hopefully that answered the question.
I feel like it did. It answered my version of the question. So thank you. I guess one last question before we finish up. is how often would you say that your requests were fulfilled versus denied? How often were you left feeling relatively satisfied with your FOIA request versus feeling, a little let down or, resigned to the fact that you probably weren't going to get what you want out of this request?
I would say for the first one, your success with FOIA depends in large part on your organizational skills. And so it's like really important to keep that spreadsheet of what requests you have out, what stage in the process they're at, and if they've been partially or completely fulfilled. If you're really on top of it organizationally and logistically, I find that the information that I requested, I almost always receive because I like work in a setting where FOIA-based litigation is so strong that if there's something preventing me from just getting the information I want, I will usually be able to get it. Where I find that I am frustrated is if I don't actually know what information I want, or the information I want isn't actually the information I need. So when I was looking at overtime, I really wanted to be able to see if end of shift arrests were being like exploited basically for overtime. And so I needed several different types of data. I needed like shift schedules, I needed the overtime payments, but I also needed like case dispositions. And I needed all these things and I couldn't really get them to match up with each other. And in the end, I like ended up confused because I had all these different types of data, but I didn't really know what I was trying to look for. I just thought once I had the data, it would become clear to me what the story was. And so it's very tempting, I think, to think that FOIA is going to solve all of your problems. And if you just send the request out there, you will get your story, you'll get your information. But FOIA is like just one tool to get very specific information that you are in a very narrow sense asking for. And so if you do want something really specific, you know who you want it from, you think they're likely to have it, then FOIA will be very satisfying. But if you're sort of just trying to figure out like, oh, I want some information, I want to be able to prove something, I think FOIA could get me there, but I don't really know what I'm looking for and how I'm going to use it, which is actually how I'm using FOIA a lot of the time. I often end up frustrated for that reason. FOIA is like a very narrow tool that's used in a very specific sense, I find, and it's very effective for that thing, but really only for like records of government agency actions.
Yeah, I find that, if you can clear like 4 or 5 really irritating hurdles, then you often get documents. Like, if you're looking for a like obscure historical actor who does not have a publicly available obituary, and you have no proof of their death, even if they died in like 1959. That's frustrating because then the FOIA is, dead on arrival. If you send a request and it's not specific enough, and so like you ask for their entire life and you find out that that's not specific enough and you have to tailor, that's a hurdle that can get you rejected. And then sometimes, you send a request and you have everything right. You've, crossed your T's and dotted your I's, and you get the document back, and it turns out it's like not an FBI file. It's a article from an internal FBI newsletter from 1982 referencing that person. And that's the only time that their name comes up in the FBI archive. So sometimes you do get documents back. You cleared all the things you need to do to send a successful FOIA, and the stuff you get back is still like not useful to you at all. And so I think there are a lot of stages where it's possible to get very frustrated. But if you can clear those first few and you can send off like a clean FOIA that has everything that they ask for, a lot of times you will get something back. You might have to wait, like I said, like 8 months to 2 years or 10 years, depending on the institution. But I find that oftentimes you can get something back if it is specific, if it clears a lot of hurdles, and if they have it, then yes, oftentimes you will get something.
One thing I'll note on this front is like most of what you're going to get back over the course of your FOIA career is really boring and really useless. Like if you request like all interdepartmental memos on excessive police use of force, most of them will be like something like where they mention police use of force in like a 400-page meeting transcript, and like most of them is like emails being like, okay, like great, let's add this one line, or like a lot of it is just sifting and getting to like the one interesting line and 500 pages of documents that you get over the course of your investigation. So a lot of it is just like, I mean, like as historians, being a a real stickler for the thing that you're actually looking for, because most of what you're looking for will be like really buried and really boring, useless documents that are of no use to you.
Or sometimes you'll just get the wrong documents. I mean, sometimes people, they'll just send me the files of like the wrong person, or like on any given day, if I sent a FOIA request in too close a proximity to somebody else, sometimes I'll get their documents and they'll get mine. Or, once I have this ongoing project of sending FOIA requests of leftist historians of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And I sent it a request for Philip Foner. And the file I got back was totally entwined with his brother, Jack Foner, who were twins, which the agency, it turns out, could not distinguish between the two of them because they had the same date of birth. So sometimes you just get files that are just wrong, or, the people who organize this stuff and who send it out are also fallible. So sometimes the information you get is just not useful.
Yeah, nothing against FOIA officers, but like they're like, as I mentioned before, like think of your FOIA officer as a benevolent genie, but a benevolent genie who like is making a lot of mistakes all the time. Like I would say like 50% of the FOIA requests I've sent have like been like I've gotten them back and it's been something completely different from what I wanted. Like I requested like body camera footage on someone who was killed by CPD, and I got like a completely different person who was killed in a completely different year. And it like was also interesting, but it just like was not what I wanted at all. Or like getting information that is like about a completely different subject area, like randomly, or getting something that like they think is answering the question, but it's not answering the question. So a benevolent genie, but like one that you have to really be on.
I love that metaphor. I'm totally going to use it. Thank you. I'll cite you.
Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I understand FOIA requests so much better now. I hope our audience does too. So thank you, Matthew and Kiran, so much for joining us. Thank you to the audience as well. For the audience and Matthew and Kiran as well. We will be having more webinars in the coming months, more in our professional development series, as well as in our Future to the Past series. So please tune in whenever you feel you want to. We will put information about that on our website. Thank you for joining us so much for this, this conversation this evening. Feel free to, say thank you to our panelists in the comments, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Also, I put my email in the chat if anyone like has any questions, wants to follow up. And I want to make a plug for FOIA Fest that the Chicago Headline Club does. They like do a very, very good job of explaining all things that you could possibly want to know about FOIA. So if you want to know more, like I would sign up for that next year. It just happened, so it'll be happening in a year.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a fantastic evening.